I wasn't looking for a conspiracy when I started photographing old city architecture. I was documenting Victorian facades, studying how urban centres evolved through industrialisation. Standard research, nothing extraordinary. But in photograph after photograph, across continents and decades, the same impossible detail kept appearing. Elegant windows half buried in sidewalks, ornate doorways terminating at street level as if the buildings had sunk into the earth. And not just one or two structures, entire city blocks showing identical signatures of submersion. The standard explanation comes quickly. Streets were raised for sanitation. Flood control projects elevated roadways. Cities built upward, burying original ground floors. It's documented, they say. It happened everywhere, except the timeline fractures under scrutiny. Because these aren't crude basement spaces that got covered over. These are architectural masterworks. Ground floors featuring stonework more elaborate than most modern building entrances. Structural systems engineered with precision that seems impossible for the supposed era. Vaulted ceilings underground that demonstrate mathematical principles allegedly not formalized until decades later. And all of this, according to official records, was constructed specifically to be buried almost immediately after completion. Why would anyone do that? Why invest extraordinary resources in craftsmanship destined for darkness? Start with what you can verify yourself. Seattle has an entire district beneath current street level, complete with storefronts and sidewalks. Chicago maintains miles of underground passages connecting buried first floors. Edinburgh's underground city preserves whole streets frozen in time. Portland, Rome, Istanbul. The pattern repeats globally. Not ancient ruins accumulated over centuries, but sophisticated 19th century construction buried within decades, sometimes within years. I found photographs showing the same buildings at different elevations. An 1870 image displays a structure at street level, entrance accessible, windows visible. An 1895 photograph shows that identical building half submerged, first floor completely below grade. 25 years. No documentation explaining how or why several meters of earth suddenly appeared. The architectural signature itself tells a stranger story. These buried levels weren't service spaces or storage areas. They were primary public interfaces, main entrances, elaborately finished interiors, features requiring master craftsmen and significant investment. Yet within a generation, they're entombed beneath raised streets with barely any contemporary record of such massive urban transformation projects. When you examine the global scope, the coordination becomes impossible to dismiss. Cities across continents, supposedly developing independently, all raising street levels during the same narrow historical window, all burying similar architectural styles, all leaving similarly inadequate documentation for what should have been enormous infrastructure undertakings. That's when I encountered the Tartaria Framework, not as definitive answer but as pattern recognition tool. Because around the mid-19th century, something shifts dramatically worldwide. Architectural sophistication appears suddenly across disconnected regions. Building techniques emerge fully formed without documented development phases. Construction quality suggests inherited knowledge rather than contemporary innovation. Look at the precision. Stonework in these buried structures shows tolerances that hand tools shouldn't achieve. Load-bearing walls incorporate engineering calculations supposedly unavailable to builders of that era. Heating and ventilation systems demonstrate thermal dynamics, understanding that predates its formal codification. These aren't primitive structures. These are sophisticated applications of advanced principles. The acoustic engineering alone raises questions. Multiple buried performance spaces, when accessible, exhibit sound design rivaling modern concert halls. Wall angles calculated for optimal reflection. Ceiling geometries enhancing specific frequencies. Material selections that manipulate resonance. All in spaces official history categorizes as utilitarian basements. Then there's the sediment itself. The material burying these structures isn't gradual urban accumulation. It's not decades of trash compressed into soil. It's meters of mud, sand, and clay deposited with characteristics suggesting rapid, catastrophic deposition. Geological layers that don't match slow street raising projects. Flood signatures. Evidence of sudden inundation rather than planned construction. I started cataloguing the documentary gaps. For urban transformations of this magnitude, you'd expect comprehensive records. Engineering surveys, municipal budgets, contractor agreements, contemporary newspaper coverage. Personal accounts from residents whose homes were being restructured. Some documentation exists, but far less than logical. And what survives often contradicts itself. Dates don't align, project descriptions remain vague. Cost figures seem impossibly low for the work supposedly accomplished. The technology records are equally sparse. We're told these construction techniques were innovations of the Industrial Revolution, yet patent filings show surprisingly little activity around the specific methods that would have been necessary. Engineering journals discuss theoretical principles but contain few practical implementation details. The knowledge appears and gets applied at massive scale without the usual trail of experimentation and refinement. This is where the investigation turns uncomfortable, because once you notice the pattern, once you see how consistently it repeats across cities worldwide, you have to ask what you're really looking at. Are these truly independent municipal projects that coincidentally happened everywhere simultaneously? Or are they inherited structures from something earlier, something more coordinated, something we've systematically forgotten or deliberately obscured? The buildings exist, the burial is documented, the architectural sophistication is measurable. What remains disputed is the explanation. And that's what makes the photographic evidence so compelling. Because cameras don't lie about elevation, they don't misremember ground levels, they show us exactly what was there. And what they show is cities built for a different world, then buried and rebuilt on top. The photographs don't just show elevation changes, they reveal something more fundamental about construction sequencing. In image after image, buildings appear complete at street level, then decades later, those same structures sit partially submerged. But here's what the official timeline can't explain. The architecture below ground is often more elaborate than what's visible above. Why would builders invest in ornate stonework, complex ventilation systems, and acoustic engineering for spaces they plan to bury? The economics make no sense. Construction budgets don't work that way. You don't hire master craftsmen to create details nobody will see, especially not in an era when labor costs dominated project expenses. Unless those details were meant to be seen. Unless the burial came later, unexpected, unplanned. Seattle's underground offers the clearest example. The official story describes deliberate street raising after the 1889 fire. Citizens voted to elevate roads for better drainage and fire prevention. Standard urban planning, right? Except when you walk those underground passages today, you're not moving through crude basements. You're walking past storefronts with display windows, residential entrances with decorative stonework, public spaces designed for foot traffic and commerce. These weren't service tunnels. These were primary streets, fully functional urban infrastructure, suddenly rendered subterranean. The timeline presents another problem. Street raising supposedly occurred between 1890 and 1907, yet photographs from 1892 show buildings at both old and new street levels simultaneously. Some structures already buried, others still accessible at ground level. Construction records suggest the project progressed block by block over years. But the geological evidence tells a different story. Core samples from multiple locations show uniform sediment deposits, not gradual fill added incrementally, not construction debris compacted over time. Homogeneous layers suggesting rapid deposition across large areas, the kind of stratification you'd associate with flooding, not municipal engineering projects. Chicago presents an even stranger pattern. Miles of freight tunnels supposedly built between 1899 and 1906 connect basement levels across downtown. Official histories credit the Illinois Tunnel Company with this vast underground network, but examine the construction specifications. The tunnels feature brick archways with precision matching, drainage systems engineered for complex flow patterns, structural reinforcement that predates documented innovations in underground construction. The official budget for this project, adjusted for inflation, couldn't possibly cover the actual work completed. The timeline suggests impossibly rapid construction given available technology, and contemporary accounts, when they exist, describe discovering tunnels rather than building them. Workers breaking through basement walls into existing passages. Engineers mapping networks that already extended beneath the city. What if they weren't building? What if they were excavating, clearing, documenting infrastructure they found rather than created? This interpretation aligns with what we observe in city after city. Not construction projects, but recovery operations. Not street raising, but adaptation to change ground levels. Not innovation, but salvage and repurposing of existing systems. The architectural evidence supports this reading. These buried structures share design principles across vast distances. Building codes that didn't exist yet. Standardization that suggests central planning rather than local variation. Construction techniques that appear fully developed without regional adaptation or experimental phases. Portland's Shanghai tunnels show the same characteristics. Edinburgh's underground vaults, Rome's buried streets. Each city's official history treats its buried architecture as unique local phenomenon. But map them globally, and the pattern becomes undeniable. Similar depths, similar construction methods, similar burial timeframes, similar documentary gaps. That coordination isn't accidental, it's systematic. Now consider the human element. Cities don't just bury their ground floors without resistance. Property owners don't voluntarily surrender prime commercial real estate. Residents don't abandon functional homes to move one story up. These changes would generate massive social friction, political battles, legal disputes, contemporary outrage documented in newspapers and municipal records. Yet that documentation barely exists. The social upheaval you'd expect from restructuring entire urban landscapes simply isn't reflected in historical sources. It's as if the changes happened with minimal public awareness or concern. as if populations accepted buried first floors as normal, necessary, unremarkable. That acceptance itself demands explanation. The most coherent framework suggests these weren't planned municipal projects at all. They were responses to something larger, something that affected cities worldwide simultaneously. An event or series of events that deposited sediment rapidly, flooding ground floors, forcing adaptation rather than choice, recovery operations, not construction projects, salvage efforts, not urban planning initiatives, communities working with what remained after something catastrophic altered the landscape. This explains the documentary gaps. You don't extensively document emergency response. You act, adapt, survive. Records get created later, often incompletely, sometimes deliberately vague, about circumstances that might raise uncomfortable questions about what actually happened. It explains the architectural consistency. If builders worldwide were adapting inherited structures rather than creating new designs, similarity makes sense. They weren't innovating. They were working within existing frameworks, modifying what remained functional, sealing what couldn't be salvaged. It explains the timeline compression. If changes happened rapidly due to external events rather than gradually through planned projects, the narrow historical window stops being coincidental. It becomes evidence of shared causation, and it explains why we're discouraged from connecting these patterns. Because once you see the coordination, once you recognize the global scope, you're forced to ask what event could cause simultaneous urban transformation worldwide. What could bury cities across continents during the same brief period? What happened that we've collectively forgotten or deliberately obscured? The answer isn't in municipal archives or construction records. It's written in the geology, visible in the photographs, measurable in the architecture itself. The sediment layers tell a story official histories avoid. Meters of deposited material containing no gradual accumulation markers. No trash layers, no organic buildup, no evidence of slow urban development. Instead, uniform deposits suggesting rapid placement. Flood sediment, catastrophic deposition. Material that arrived suddenly, not gradually over decades. Geologists examining these layers find them troubling. The composition doesn't match what centuries of normal urban activity should produce. Too clean in some ways, too chaotic in others, sorted in patterns consistent with water deposition, not human dumping, containing materials that shouldn't be mixed together if the accumulation was gradual. Stand at the interface between current street level and buried architecture. That boundary represents something. Not planned construction, something else. Cities worldwide hit this same boundary within a narrow time frame. Different continents, different climates, different geological contexts. Yet the pattern repeats with precision that defies coincidence. What could cause that? The official answer fragments into inadequate local explanations. This city raised streets for sanitation. That city needed flood control. Another expanded infrastructure. Each reason sounds plausible in isolation, but apply basic logic to the global pattern, and those explanations collapse. You're telling me dozens of major cities independently decided to bury functional architecture within the same 30-year window, that populations worldwide simultaneously accepted losing ground floor access, that engineers across continents arrived at identical solutions without documented coordination? The probability approaches zero, which means we're not looking at independent municipal decisions. We're observing coordinated response to shared circumstances. Cities adapting to change conditions, using similar methods because they faced similar problems. What changed? something environmental, something that affected ground levels globally, something severe enough to make burying existing structures the practical choice rather than clearing and rebuilding. The evidence points toward multiple catastrophic events, not a single apocalyptic moment, but a series of disruptions occurring within compressed time frame. Floods that deposited meters of sediment, earthquakes that shifted ground levels, climate disruptions that altered water tables and drainage patterns, events that historical record minimizes or omits entirely. Now we arrive at the mechanism of forgetting. Because clearly something happened, yet collective memory barely acknowledges it. That amnesia isn't natural, it's cultivated. Consider what gets preserved versus what disappears. Grand narratives of progress, industrial achievement, human triumph over nature, these dominate historical record. Stories of catastrophe, civilizational disruption, lost capabilities, these get minimized, fragmented, relegated to footnotes. The pattern suggests deliberate curation. Not conspiracy exactly, but systematic preference for narratives that support particular worldviews. Histories that place us at civilization's apex rather than part way up a slope others climbed before. When you find evidence contradicting that narrative, evidence suggesting we inherited rather than invented, evidence pointing towards cyclical rise and fall rather than linear progress, institutional resistance activates, not through dramatic suppression, through subtle discouragements, academic gatekeeping that dismisses uncomfortable questions as pseudoscience, funding structures that reward conventional interpretations, publishing norms that favor established narratives over challenging evidence. The result is predictable. Researchers self-censor. Questions don't get asked. Patterns remain unconnected. Each city's buried architecture stays isolated curiosity rather than becoming data point in global phenomenon, until someone looks at the whole picture. What we call Tartaria might not be single empire or civilization. It might be framework for understanding cyclical patterns in human development. Recognition that sophisticated societies rose, built extensively, then collapsed or transformed, leaving infrastructure their successors inherited without fully understanding. Those successors, us, built our cities atop ruins we barely acknowledge. We adapted existing structures, claimed them as our achievements, wrote histories placing ourselves as originators rather than inheritors. The buried windows aren't just architectural curiosities. They're evidence of discontinuity, proof that our civilization's foundation rests on something we've forgotten or chosen to ignore, and that forgetting serves purposes. It protects comfortable assumptions about human progress. It validates current institutional authorities as culmination of development rather than temporary phase in longer cycle. It prevents uncomfortable questions about what capabilities existed before, how they were lost, whether we're actually advancing or just recovering. Walk through any major city, notice the buried architectural details. Ask yourself what you're standing on top of. The answer isn't in official histories. It's beneath your feet, visible to anyone willing to look past accepted narratives and examine physical evidence without preconception. These structures existed. They were buried. The timeline doesn't match official explanations. The global coordination demands better accounting than independent municipal decisions. Something happened that we've collectively forgotten, that transformed landscapes worldwide, that forced civilizations to rebuild atop their own ruins. Whether you call it Tartaria or something else, whether you believe in lost empires or simply acknowledge gaps in documented history, the evidence remains. Cities buried their own foundations within living memory, yet somehow this massive undertaking left minimal documentary trace. That absence itself tells you something. We're not at the peak of human achievement looking back at primitive ancestors. We're somewhere in the middle, walking on buried sophistication we barely recognize, building with inherited knowledge we claim as invention. The ground beneath our cities holds truths official histories can't accommodate, and until we're willing to excavate those truths, literally and figuratively, we'll remain ignorant of our actual position in civilization's longer arc. The photographs don't lie, the sediment layers don't fabricate their composition. The architectural precision doesn't exaggerate its sophistication. What lies beneath our cities is real, measurable, undeniable. Yet we walk past buried windows daily without questioning why they exist. We accept explanations that crumble under basic scrutiny. We treat global patterns as local coincidences because connecting them requires abandoning comfortable narratives about human progress. That comfort comes at a cost. Every sealed chamber represents knowledge we've chosen not to pursue. Every unexplained architectural feature marks a question we've decided not to ask. Every documentary gap signals history curated rather than preserved. You don't need to accept Tartaria as historical fact to recognize something fundamental is wrong with official timelines. You just need to look at what exists, compare it to what we're told, and notice where they diverge. The buried cities aren't waiting to be discovered. They're already here, beneath the streets, visible to anyone willing to see past institutional explanations that protect assumptions rather than pursue truth. What we've forgotten matters less than recognizing we've forgotten something. Because once you see the pattern, once you acknowledge the coordination, once you accept that physical evidence contradicts official narratives, you can't return to comfortable certainty. The foundations beneath our feet hold answers we're not supposed to seek, and that prohibition itself reveals how much we still have to uncover.